The Secret History of Edward VII's Punishment. History often remembers kings and queens through their crowns, their victories, and the grand moments that shaped nations. But behind every royal portrait, behind every official record, there are private struggles, hidden conflicts, and personal stories that reveal a very different side of power. One of the most fascinating stories from the British royal family is the story of Edward VII, a man who would one day become King of the United Kingdom, but whose youth was marked by pressure, disappointment, and a very unusual form of royal discipline. Edward VII was born on November 9, 1841, as the eldest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. From the moment he entered the world, his future was already decided. He was not simply a child. He was the future ruler of one of the most powerful empires in history. But being born into royalty did not mean living a life without difficulties. In fact, Edward's childhood was filled with expectations that few ordinary people could ever understand. His mother, Queen Victoria, had a strict vision of what a future king should be. His father, Prince Albert, believed deeply in discipline, education, and responsibility. Together, they wanted to create the perfect heir. But Edward was not the child they imagined. He was energetic, social, emotional, and far more interested in the world around him than in endless lessons and royal duties. Prince Albert became increasingly concerned that his son was not taking his future seriously enough. The young prince struggled with the heavy burden placed on him. Every mistake was seen not as a normal mistake of a child, but as a possible weakness in the future king. And this created one of the most famous conflicts inside the Victorian royal household. Prince Albert decided that Edward needed stricter control. He believed that the prince's habits, friendships, and behavior had to be corrected before he inherited the throne. The young Edward was pushed into a demanding routine of studies, military training, and royal preparation. But the pressure only made the relationship between father and son more complicated. Many historians believe that Edward felt misunderstood. Instead of receiving warmth and encouragement, he often felt that he was being judged by impossible standards. The biggest controversy came when Edward was sent away for a period of intense study and discipline. The royal family hoped that distance and strict education would transform him into the perfect future monarch. But the result was not exactly what they expected. Edward grew up surrounded by rules, but he also developed a strong desire for freedom. This tension between duty and personal happiness would follow him for the rest of his life. The story of Edward VII is not simply about a prince who broke rules. It is about a man trapped between who he was expected to be and who he wanted to become. Years later, Edward would become known as a charming, diplomatic, and influential king. But before he wore the crown, he had to survive years of criticism, family pressure, and the weight of expectations. The punishment Edward experienced was not just one single event. It was a lifetime of being shaped by others. A future king who was constantly reminded that his every action mattered. A son who wanted approval from parents who demanded perfection. And a man whose private struggles were hidden behind the walls of Buckingham Palace. But the most surprising part of Edward's story is that the very qualities criticized during his youth would later help him become one of Britain's most socially successful monarchs. His love of conversation, culture, and people things, once viewed as distractions, became some of his greatest strengths. To understand Edward VII, we have to look beyond the crown, because sometimes the greatest secrets of history are not found in battles or political decisions. They are found in the personal stories of the people who lived behind the throne. As Edward grew older, the conflict between his royal duties and his personal nature became even more visible. The young prince was constantly watched. Every conversation, every friendship, and every decision could become a subject of discussion inside the royal household. For most people, making a mistake means learning a lesson and moving forward. But for Edward, mistakes carried a much heavier weight. He was the future king. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert believed that the personality of the monarch could influence the entire nation. They feared that if Edward became careless or irresponsible, the future of the monarchy itself could be damaged. This fear shaped the way they raised him. Prince Albert especially believed that discipline created character. He wanted Edward to be serious, intelligent, and morally strong. But Edward had a completely different personality. He enjoyed social gatherings. He loved meeting people. He was interested in music, fashion, theater, and conversation. To many around him, these interests seemed like signs that he lacked the seriousness expected from a future ruler. But another interpretation was possible. Edward was developing a skill that many great leaders need: the ability to understand people. While his parents focused on books and formal education, Edward was learning from society itself. He observed how people behaved. He listened to different opinions. He learned how to connect with individuals from different backgrounds. These abilities would later become important during his reign. However, during his youth, these qualities were often criticized. The most famous example of the tension between Edward and his parents came during his time at university. Edward's parents hoped that university life would strengthen his discipline and prepare him for leadership, but instead it became a period where he experienced more independence. He was no longer completely under the direct control of his parents. He met new people, he explored new interests, and he began to develop a life separate from the strict image his family wanted for him. This created anxiety within the royal household. Prince Albert was deeply disappointed. He believed his son was wasting an important opportunity. The relationship between father and son became colder. Then came an event that would change the course of Edward's life. Edward was accused of becoming involved in a situation that his parents considered inappropriate for a future king. The details of private royal life were often hidden, and many stories from that era became surrounded by rumors and exaggeration. But what is clear is that Prince Albert was deeply troubled. He felt that Edward was failing to understand the responsibility of his position. Albert decided that he needed to confront his son directly. The meeting between father and son became one of the most emotional moments in Edward's early life. Albert tried to explain the seriousness of the situation. He wanted Edward to understand that his actions could affect not only himself, but also the entire country. For Edward, however, this was another moment where he felt judged rather than understood. He was not treated simply as a young man making mistakes. He was treated as a future king who could not afford to be human. The pressure became overwhelming. Soon after Prince Albert's health began to decline, the stress surrounding Edward's behavior had affected him deeply. In December 1861, Prince Albert died. His death had a devastating impact on Queen Victoria. She entered a long period of mourning and blamed Edward's behavior for contributing to the tragedy. Whether this blame was fair or not remains a subject of historical debate, but the emotional consequences were real. Edward lost his father. His mother became distant from him. And for many years, he carried the reputation of being the son who disappointed the great Prince Albert. This became another form of punishment, not an official sentence, not a public humiliation, but a lasting shadow over his identity. For decades, Edward lived under the memory of his father's disappointment. Yet history would eventually reveal a different side of him. The same man who was criticized as a young prince would later prove that leadership was not only about strict discipline, it was also about understanding people, adapting to change, and building relationships. Edward VII's journey was far from simple. Before he became king, he had to overcome years of criticism, family conflict, and the burden of expectations. But the greatest transformation was still ahead, because the prince who was once considered a failure would one day become one of the most important figures of his era. After the death of Prince Albert, Edward's life changed completely. The person who had been the strongest force controlling his education and behavior was gone. But instead of gaining complete freedom, Edward found himself facing a different kind of pressure. Queen Victoria never fully recovered from the loss of her husband. Her grief shaped the rest of her life, and she became even more distant from public life. Many people around the Queen believed that Edward's actions had disappointed his father and caused unnecessary stress during Albert's final days. This belief created a painful situation for Edward. He had lost his father, but he had also lost his mother's trust. The young prince became almost isolated within his own family. He was still the heir to the throne, but emotionally, he was separated from the people who were supposed to guide him. For years, Edward lived in the shadow of a reputation created during his youth. People saw him as a prince who enjoyed pleasure too much and responsibility too little. The press often focused on his social life. Critics questioned whether he had the seriousness required for leadership. But what many people failed to recognize was that Edward was living in a changing world. The 19th century was transforming rapidly. Industry was expanding. Cities were growing. New ideas were spreading. The role of a monarch was changing. A king could no longer rule only through tradition and authority. A successful monarch needed to understand society, and Edward was naturally good at that. While Queen Victoria became associated with a more private and traditional image of the monarchy, Edward represented a different style. He enjoyed meeting politicians, artists, writers, and foreign leaders. He believed that conversation and personal relationships could strengthen the influence of the crown. At the time, some viewed this as a weakness, but later, many would see it as one of his greatest strengths. Edward spent many years waiting for a throne that seemed impossible to reach. Because Queen Victoria lived a very long life, Edward remained Prince of Wales for nearly 6 decades. This created a unique situation. Most heirs become king after only a short period of preparation. Edward had to wait. And waiting created frustration. He was a future king with no real power. He had responsibilities, but limited authority. He had expectations placed on him, but few opportunities to make decisions. This long period shaped his personality. Edward learned patience. He learned how to observe. He learned how to influence people without directly controlling them. But he also developed habits that would later attract criticism. He loved luxury. He enjoyed expensive clothing, fine food, and entertainment. To some, this seemed inappropriate for a future monarch. But Edward saw social life as part of his role. He believed that a prince should represent confidence and elegance. The world around him was changing, and he wanted the monarchy to remain connected to modern society. During these years, Edward also became known for his relationships and friendships. His personal life became a constant source of public interest. The Victorian era had strict ideas about morality and public behavior. Because Edward was royal, his private choices were judged more harshly than those of ordinary people. Every rumor became a political issue. Every friendship became a subject of debate. This was another form of punishment. Edward was never allowed to simply exist as a person. He was always viewed as a symbol. The young man who wanted freedom was constantly reminded that he belonged to the crown. But despite all criticism, Edward continued developing his own approach to leadership. He traveled. He represented Britain abroad, he met foreign leaders, he built connections that would later become valuable for international relations. Slowly, the image of Edward began to change. The careless prince was becoming an experienced statesman. The man once criticized for his personality was proving that personality itself could be a political tool. However, one question remained. When Edward finally became king, would people remember his mistakes or his achievements? Would he remain the disappointing son of Prince Albert? Or would he become the monarch Britain needed? The answer would come after the death of Queen Victoria. And when that moment arrived, Edward VII would finally step out of his father's shadow. For almost 60 years, Edward had waited. A lifetime had passed since he was a young prince struggling under the expectations of his parents. The world had changed. The British Empire had expanded. Politics had evolved. Society had entered a new age. And yet Edward was still waiting for the moment when he would finally become what everyone had prepared him to be. Then on January 22nd, 1901, Queen Victoria died. After a reign of more than 63 years, the Victorian era came to an end. The crown passed to her son. At the age of 59, Edward finally became King Edward VII. For many people, this moment was unexpected. They had spent decades hearing stories about the irresponsible young prince. Some wondered whether the man who had been criticized for so long could truly become a successful monarch. But Edward was no longer the young boy his parents had tried to control. He was an experienced man who had spent decades studying people, politics, and diplomacy. His long wait had prepared him in ways that traditional education could not. The new king brought a different style to the monarchy. Queen Victoria had represented duty, seriousness, and stability. Edward represented connection, conversation, and public presence. He understood that the monarchy needed to be visible. He attended events, he met citizens, he supported cultural life. He created an image of a more approachable royal family. Some critics still remembered his youth and doubted him. But gradually, Edward began to prove them wrong. One of his greatest strengths was diplomacy. Edward enjoyed meeting foreign leaders and building personal relationships. He understood that a friendly conversation could sometimes achieve what formal negotiations could not. This skill became especially valuable as Europe moved toward a complicated political future. His reign was not extremely long, lasting only about 9 years, but its impact was significant. Edward helped modernize the public image of the monarchy. He showed that leadership was not only about strict rules and formal behavior, it was also about understanding the mood of the people. The same personality traits that had been criticized in his youth became advantages. His love of society became a diplomatic tool. His ability to communicate became a political strength. His knowledge of different people helped him represent Britain on the world stage. The irony of Edward's story is that the qualities his parents feared most were the qualities that later helped him succeed. Prince Albert wanted a perfect, disciplined heir. Instead, Britain received a king who understood human nature. But Edward's past never completely disappeared. The memory of his father remained. The criticism from his childhood remained. The feeling that he had disappointed his family remained. In many ways, Edward carried the emotional consequences of those early years throughout his life. The punishment was not a single event. It was a lifelong experience of being judged. A prince who was constantly reminded that he was not good enough. A son who lived with the disappointment of his parents. A future king who had to prove himself before the entire world. Yet history often changes its opinion. The man who was once considered a failure became a successful monarch. The prince who was criticized for loving society became a king who used society as a way to strengthen Britain's influence. Edward VII's story shows that people are often more complicated than the reputation created around them. A person can grow. A person can change. And sometimes the very things others criticize can become the foundation of future success. But there is still another hidden chapter, because behind Edward's public success was a private world of relationships, secrets, and personal battles that continued to shape his life until the end. Behind the image of King Edward VII as a confident and charming monarch, there was another side of his life the public rarely saw. The world saw a king who smiled easily, who enjoyed conversation, and who seemed comfortable among politicians, artists, and foreign royalty. But behind that public image was a man who had spent decades carrying the weight of criticism. Edward's childhood experiences never completely left him. The judgment he received from his parents, especially from Prince Albert, shaped his personality in ways that remained with him throughout his life. He became someone who deeply valued acceptance. He wanted to be liked. He wanted people around him to feel comfortable. Some historians believe that this desire came partly from the emotional distance he experienced during childhood. Edward had spent years feeling that he was constantly failing to meet expectations. As king, he wanted to create an atmosphere very different from the strict environment of his early years. His royal court became known for its social energy. There were dinners, conversations, cultural gatherings, and meetings with influential figures. To some traditionalists, this looked like unnecessary luxury. But Edward believed that these gatherings had a purpose. A conversation over dinner could build trust between powerful people. A personal friendship could influence international relations. A friendly meeting could reduce tension between countries. This was Edward's style of leadership. Not through commands, not through fear, but through relationships. However, his lifestyle also brought criticism. Many people questioned his love of luxury and entertainment. They argued that a king should be more serious and restrained. The old accusations from his youth returned. The same qualities that made him popular also made some people suspicious. Was Edward truly responsible? Or was he simply an older version of the carefree prince? This question followed him throughout his reign. But events would prove that Edward understood his role better than many expected. One important area where Edward made an impact was international diplomacy. Europe at the beginning of the 20th century was becoming increasingly complicated. Countries were competing for influence. Military power was growing. Alliances were forming. The smallest misunderstanding could create major consequences. Edward used his personal connections to improve Britain's relationships with other nations. His travels and meetings helped create stronger connections abroad. He was especially interested in improving relations with countries that had previously been rivals. His approach was different from the formal and distant style of earlier diplomacy. He believed that people who trusted each other could negotiate more effectively. This became part of his legacy. But even while he was king, some people still remembered the young Edward who had disappointed his father. The shadow of Prince Albert remained. It is one of the most interesting contradictions in Edward's story. The man who had been considered unprepared for leadership spent his entire adult life preparing for it. Every year of waiting became another year of experience. Every criticism became another lesson. Every struggle shaped the king he eventually became. Edward's reign also revealed something important about the monarchy itself. A ruler does not succeed only because of tradition or inheritance. A ruler succeeds by understanding the time they live in, Queen Victoria's world had been one of strict values and deep tradition. Edward's world was faster, more social, and more connected. He adapted to that world, and perhaps that was the greatest lesson from his life. The boy who could not fit into his father's perfect image became the king who created his own image. But Edward's story was still not finished, because as he became older and more respected, questions about his health, his private habits, and the future of the monarchy began to appear. The same pressures that followed him from childhood continued until the final years of his life. And the ending of Edward VII's story would reveal just how much a lifetime of expectation had shaped him. As Edward VII entered the final years of his life, the world around him had changed dramatically. The young prince who had once been criticized, controlled, and doubted had become a respected king. The same man who was once described as a disappointment had transformed into a symbol of a new era. But history is rarely simple. Edward's success did not erase the struggles of his past. The memories of his childhood remained part of who he was. He had spent much of his life trying to prove himself, trying to show that he was not the failure people once believed him to be, and perhaps that constant need to prove himself shaped the way he ruled. Edward understood that a monarch could not live completely separated from society. He believed the crown needed to connect with people. He brought energy and visibility to the monarchy at a time when many traditional institutions were facing questions about their future. His reign helped create a bridge between the old world of Queen Victoria and the modern world that was beginning to emerge. But behind the public success, Edward's health was declining. Years of stress, pressure, and a demanding lifestyle had taken their toll. The king who had spent decades waiting for power had only a short time to fully enjoy it. On May 6, 1910, Edward VII died. His death marked the end of the Edwardian era. People across Britain and beyond mourned him. The world had lost a king who had changed the image of monarchy. But his story remained full of contradictions. He was a prince who was criticized for being too social, yet his social abilities became one of his greatest strengths. He was considered too careless, yet he became a skilled diplomat. He was seen as a disappointment, yet he became a successful monarch. The punishment of Edward VII was not a prison, a public humiliation, or a formal sentence. His punishment was something far more personal. It was growing up under impossible expectations. It was being judged before he had the chance to define himself. It was living as a symbol before being allowed to live as a person. The story of Edward VII reminds us that history is not only about crowns and kingdoms. It is about human beings, people who struggle, people who make mistakes, people who change. Edward was shaped by criticism, but he was not destroyed by it. The qualities that others saw as weaknesses became the qualities that helped him succeed. His life shows that a person's early reputation does not always determine their final legacy. The young prince who disappointed his father became the king who helped guide Britain into a new century. And perhaps The greatest secret of Edward VII's story is this. Sometimes the very things that people try to suppress in us are the things that later become our greatest strengths. Edward VII's journey was not the story of a perfect king. It was the story of a complicated man who lived under extraordinary pressure and eventually found his own way to lead. A story of expectations, a story of transformation, a story hidden behind the walls of royalty,